Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 1. Sarah twisted and turned on the cold concrete floor, trying in vain to get comfy enough to fall asleep. She had been living in this very dungeon for 5 years, and yet she still couldn't get used to the funky scent and the crappy food, and neither could she stand sleeping on the spiky floor. She had cramps all over, and her neck felt as if it was falling off her shoulders. Maybe it wasn't a good idea to try and elevate her head using the small, rusty plate she had been fed in not too long ago. As Sarah tried to bear through her everlasting torture, a loud beating against metal sounded, then someone spoke loudly, the voice belonging to none other than Mr. Knack, the owner of the human trade branch she was currently residing at. "Today's your lucky day, sluts. The mighty Damon Callisto." He stretched the word mighty with thick malice, as his heavy footsteps resounded through the dark dungeon, striking fear into all who heard him approaching. "Is coming to get himself another sex slave, so everyone's going to see daylight for a few minutes. You better keep yourselves in check, because anyone who acts out will eat and sleep with my cock down their throat. Got it?" A series of submissive yes sirs from other women followed his warning, but as for Sarah, her curiosity was just beginning to surface. Who is this Damon Callisto?" she dared to ask, sitting up slowly despite the lower back pains that plagued her. From day one, they've never been allowed out of their cells unless they were chosen, bathing, or dead. The werewolves were the ones who entered the dungeon and chose whoever suited their tastes. So now that this particular person was receiving special treatments, she was simply curious of his identity and influence. But Mr. Knack thought of it otherwise. His eyes narrowed and he cracked his neck in preparation for what's to come. He threw the leather whip over his shoulder, then walked closer to her cell until Sarah could vaguely see him through the rusty silver bars. "You dare to speak up when I didn't ask you to?" he said, grinning wickedly as he fished the key from his chest pocket and shoved it into the keyhole. Sarah immediately curled herself into a ball. She knew exactly what would happen after Mr. Knack grins like that, and it certainly wasn't a good experience. "Sorry," she mumbled, covering her mouth as she realized her mistake. She shouldn't have said anything. She should have just kept her mouth shut. But if she was going to regret it now, there wasn't any use. He showed absolutely no mercy when anyone disobeyed his rules, and once he's hell-bent on having her punished, he'd definitely see it through. "I guess you didn't learn your lesson yesterday, so I'll make sure you know to keep your mouth shut this time around. Clothes off!" He smirked whilst unbuckling his belt as he slowly walked up to her with the eyes of a predator and the expression of a complete lunatic. Sarah didn't want to do it. Her mind and body was totally against such a disgusting idea. However, after so many experiences, she knew that resistance would not get her anywhere. It would only make things worse. With paled face and hesitant hitches to her movements, she reached for the straps of her dress and began to slide it off her shoulders. But just when her breasts surfaced from under her clothing, one of Mr. Knack's subordinates came running in, alarm printed on his face. "Sir, the Alpha King is expected to arrive within an hour. He only wants to choose from humans who have blue eyes and black hair." The predacious look faded from his eyes, and Mr. Knack quickly shuffled to fix his pants, his keys jingling in his hands. "Then what are you waiting for? Hurry up and find all the women he wants. We can't have him displeased or it will be the end of us." Sarah's eyes swirled with confusion, and her fingers went stiff around her straps. She didn't know what the sudden rush was for, but she sighed in relief either way. She was thankful for whatever this disturbance was, because otherwise, she would have been completely done for. Within a few minutes, all human women with blue eyes and black hair were placed on a large podium, and the chair designated for their client was left in front of them. At first, they had been well organized into 5 horizontal groups of 10. But that alignment was soon long forgotten, and now the girls were bundled up against each other, some whispering amongst themselves while others stood silently as they waited for another command. Sarah was one of the silent ones crammed up at the back. After all the years passed, Mr. Knack had already discarded the possibility of her ever getting chosen, so he made sure to place her at the very back. She didn't mind because she too thought the same. But what she did have a problem with was how suffocating the place was. It was the first time she had been outside the dungeons in years, but she couldn't even enjoy it to the fullest. All she wanted to do right now was head back to the dungeons. The longer she stayed, the more blurrier her eyes became and the more jelly-like her feet felt. Her blue eyes and black hair were to be blamed for this calamity. A few minutes passed before Mr. Knack announced that the Alpha King has arrived and was now voicing his instructions, but Sarah was the only one who hardly paid him much attention. She blinked rapidly in an attempt to get rid of the blurriness in her eyes and held onto the shoulder of a woman when she found herself struggling to keep her body upright. Biting her lip, she moved her eyes away from her feet and craned her neck to see the cruel werewolf who had made her stand so long that she could hardly even breathe. With one single sweep, her eyes spotted a man sitting in front of the podium, staring coldly at all the women before him. If he was the Damon Callisto Mr. Knack spoke of, then she wasn't sure if he came to find a sex slave or if he came to kill them all. Because the look on his face was definitely a deadly one. But despite how dangerous he appeared even from afar, Sarah couldn't help but admire him. He was wearing a spotless blue suit with a white undershirt and blue tie. His black hair was caught at the back nicely, giving good view of his perfect hazel eyes, full lips, and sharp jawline. Every single thing about him was spectacular, but when it came to his eyes, all else seemed like a shadow from behind. Beauty such as this had never graced her eyes before, not from what she remembered. All she had seen for 5 years straight was Mr. Knack and his lackeys. To put it bluntly, they weren't a beautiful sight. Aside from his looks, there was something else that drew her to him, something that somehow felt like a magnetic pull. Once she looked at him, she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. Was it the dangerous vibe he gave off? The dominance his eyes demanded? Or was she just merely drawn to him like a woman to a man? She couldn't tell which one, but she was sure that this man was very different from the rest. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt a bit self-conscious when his eyes traveled across all the women and landed on her. Her stomach instantly did a few flips. This feeling was new to her, and she had no idea what it meant. But the guy seemed to know exactly what was going on, because a second after he laid eyes on her, his eyes bulged out of their sockets and he immediately flew out of his seat. Sarah stiffened, a blush on her cheeks. She really wanted to continue staring at his face while examining his alluring features, but a sudden dizziness caused everything around her to blur. As she was caught up with their staring match, she failed to realize that she had been sweating non-stop all along, and now even her hair that was supposed to be blowing with the wind was now stiff against her skin. It wasn't much long after that her legs decided to give out, and she fell to the floor like a sack of potatoes as her heavy eyelids drooped to veil her blue orbs. Panic swarmed the woman around her, but before anyone could even take a good look at her, a golden-eyed figure shoved through the crowd swiftly and warm hands took her into their comfy embrace, igniting tingles along her skin. Whispers erupted among the girls, but Sarah could barely hear a thing. The only words she managed to make out were the words of the person who was holding her. "My mate! Mine!" The husky voice thundered just before she blacked out completely. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 2. New Home. Damon Calesto was sitting on a small stool in his living room. His eyes were glued to something, or rather someone, who had taken his breath away in one swift motion. He studied her every feature, from the long lashes on her eyelids down to the almost unnoticeable pimple at the side of her lips. He knew that it was a creepy thing to do, but he couldn't help himself. She was just too beautiful not to admire. He noticed everything, including how her small, button nose twitched whenever she shifted, and how her lips protruded into a pout every once in a while. His eyes caught every single detail and imprinted it all in his mind. Everything about her, he wanted to know. Everything she did before she met him, he wanted to know. Everything. Just everything. He had been entrapped since the very moment he laid eyes on her. Her blue eyes had pulled him in with ease, and he fell deep into her abysses. He knew exactly what that dazed, inebriated feeling meant. She was his mate. After what happened 10 years ago, he had been so sure that his chances of ever having a mate was zero. But now, it was shocking to see that he actually had one. Not that he wanted one in the first place. The thing was, he wasn't very fond of the mate thing. He thought of it as an unfortunate string that tied together two random souls that aren't really meant to be. Plus, nobody had the right to tell him what to do. Not even the moon goddess who created him. He alone must decide his fate. Who to love and who to despise. Who to protect and who to kill. However, now that he got a first-hand taste of the mate bond, he had a totally different view. It was the first time in a long while since he had ever felt so intrigued and attracted to a woman. When they had been staring at each other, he didn't want the experience to end. But then, before he could even open his mouth to speak to her, she had blacked out. He was angry at the fact that he didn't get to hear her voice. He was angry at the fact that he had been living in such luxury while she had been living under such harsh conditions. And lastly, he was angry at the fact that she was filled with cuts and bruises all over her body. All he was desperately waiting for was her confirmation that the human trade workers had done this to her. That was all he needed to wipe them all out in the blink of an eye. From now on, anyone who dared to touch, hurt, or even look at her would feel his wrath. Damon! Alexis, one of his sex slaves, came bouncing into the room. Damon casted an irritated glance at her for a split second before placing his full attention back on his mate. She pouted, but didn't say anything about it. "I have never seen a werewolf who is mated to a human," she started to say, whilst eyeing Sarah with a disgusted yet envious glint in her eyes. How is this even possible? Damon clenched his jaw. Who did she think she was to question him, when he too didn't even know the answer, nor did he want to know? He didn't care about why and how. He just knew that she was his mate. Nothing else mattered. Alexis jolted as soon as she saw his deadly glare. That look in his eyes only meant danger, and she knew it. Without another word, she shuffled out there with her tail between her legs. But as she was turning the corner, she mumbled something that she thought Damon didn't catch. "Don't come crying to me when you meet the same doom like 10 years ago." But Damon had heard every word, and he was livid. He had the urge to crush her face with his bare hands, but he didn't dare to ruin his moment with his mate. Alexis could stay for later. After all, she can never leave this house, so he had all the time in the world to rip her to pieces. An hour after solely sitting and watching her, Sarah finally stirred awake. She opened her eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling, the fresh air drifting into her nose, feeling very foreign to her senses. Bright light was escaping through the window and touching her skin delicately, leaving it glistening before Damon's onlooking eyes. With all these unfamiliar things taken into consideration, Sarah soon realized that she was not in her cell. She jolted into a sitting position and was about to turn her head in the direction where Damon was sitting, when she felt his warm breath tickle the skin of her neck. She immediately stiffened, breath hitched and heartbeat quickening. Damon's nose nuzzled into her ear, sniffing as it traveled along her neck. He hummed against her, basking in her delicious lotus flower scent. The first thing he wanted to do was to ask her how she got the bruises on her skin, but he tried to refrain from doing so. It was better to make her feel comfortable first before asking her anything about herself, nor what happened at that dungeon. When silence reigned for too long, he took one last whiff of her scent, then looked up at her questioningly. Seeing the anxious look on her face and the dark shade of red that coated her cheeks, he leaned back a bit and reluctantly pushed his stool further outwards to give her some well-needed space. He was heavily irritated by the far proximity, but he willed himself to bear with it for her sake. Sarah finally released the breath she had been holding and turned to look at him slowly, her mind filling with dread. His voice already gave her an idea of who he was, but when she turned and looked at him for a second time, she couldn't help but feel bombarded by his unmatchable beauty. Just like before, she unknowingly paid no attention to the fact that he knew she was staring at him and continued to do so on impulse, feeding her desire to capture his features into her memory. "Speak," Damon demanded, his nonchalant, authoritative tone instantly grasping her attention. He was getting tired of waiting for her to say something when it seemed as if she wouldn't be speaking anytime soon. He desperately wanted to hear her voice, and as such, curiosity was about to devour him. Sarah mentally slapped herself. She was so busy oogling him that she had completely forgotten that she was in an unfamiliar place. "Where am I?" she asked frantically, finally taking a glance around the room. The house was more large and spacious than anything she had ever seen before, so her awe was bound to have been at great heights. She was sitting on a gray couch that could probably be passed off as a bed because of how large and comfy it was, and in front of her, a glass table separated it from another of its size and color. On the gray walls, there were numerous paintings of wolves and such, and the shelves to her left was filled with a mix of books and trophies. The space seemed somewhat empty, but Sarah couldn't help but be mesmerized despite that. "This is your new home," Damon told her, watching her intently as her eyes circulated. He definitely liked how impressed she looked. If it only took this to wow her, then he could only imagine how happy she'd be to see the rest of the mansion. "My home? Why am I here? Did something happen after I passed out? Have I done something wrong?" Her awe was gone, and she was getting worried now. She didn't know what was happening, nor how great of a problem she was in. "Whatever it is, I'm sorry. I was just feeling a little dizzy at the—" Damon pressed his finger to her lips without hesitance, halting her rant immediately. "I am the Alpha King, and I chose you. From now on, you are my possession, mine to keep and mine to protect. You will stay by my side, Sarah." where my eyes can always reach you. Tingles sprouted at her lips and spread across her skin. Then once again, her heart took speed. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 3. Weird Experiences. Damon pressed his finger to her lips, halting her rant immediately. You are here because I chose you. From now on, you are my possession, mine to keep, and mine to protect. You will stay by my side, Sarah, where my eyes can always reach you. Those words jogged back memories that made her stiffen as confusion logged itself deep within her soul. Everything that he said just now contradicted everything that she heard from everyone else. Protect? Damon Calesto, aka the Alpha King, doesn't protect anyone. All he does is kill, and kill. She knew that for sure because a few months back, some newcomers at the dungeon had been gossiping about how ruthless he was. And judging by all that they had said, being around him right now was not a good idea. At the time when werewolves took full authority over humans, they all voted for an Alpha King, one that everyone thought would be suitable for the job. But that chosen Alpha King isn't the one of merit nor notoriety. It's the one who wiped out the whole royal family and took his place. Among both humans and werewolves, he's known as the Devil. Anyone who crosses him, whether young or old, would have to face the blazing fire from the pit of hell. And that isn't all. If a wild wolf howls or a deer hollers and disrupts his slumber, they would face their demise that very night. If you ever managed to encounter him and live to tell the tale, you'd become a legend. Right now, she was sitting before that very man. It wasn't clear whether she'd die or not within the next upcoming second, so she wasn't exactly what you'd call a legend. His words had sounded like a love confession or something of that sort, yet she took it as his way of telling her that he'd be watching her every move, and then the moment she messes up, it would be the end of her. With that in mind, she was supposed to be scared. She was supposed to cry and beg for mercy. But somehow, she didn't feel like doing any of that. What she did do, though, was flinch away from him. Then, without much thought, her right index finger moved upwards and pressed against her lip that had been tingling non-stop when he touched her. She was confused by the odd sensation as much as she was intrigued. Why? She started to ask, eyes temporarily losing focus on Damon as she became trapped in a world of wonder. Why does it tingle? Damon's shoulders slackened at her words. When she had flinched away from him, he feared that she was scared of him. But now that he knew that she was simply curious, his mind was certainly at ease. However, there was still one thing that bothered him. He felt satisfied when others feared him, but for some reason, her being scared of him didn't sit right with him. Why? He wasn't so sure. How did he feel about it? He was irritated. Very irritated. A mere human shouldn't have so much effect on him, was what he thought. He was slowly getting to the conclusion that his turn of events wouldn't be good for him. At all. We are mates, he finally answered, shifting languidly on the stool. The tingles are simply something brought along by the mate bond to bring us closer together. Upon hearing those words, Sarah's mouth parted silently in disbelief. Mates? When since did werewolves have human mates? And how could she, a mere sex slave, be the mate of an alpha? Surely for anyone else, the former would have been their biggest problem and concern. But for Sarah, it was the latter. She had been stuck in a cell for ages. No one found her attractive enough to even look at, much less think about choosing. Yet the Alpha King was telling her that she was his mate? It was bound to sound unbelievable. Seeing the confusion in her eyes, Damon opted to give her an explanation. A mate is someone who... I know what it means. Oh, he blinked. I see. It had been years, thousands of years, since someone had cut into his sentence. The last time it happened, his irritation had pushed him to pull his subordinate's tongue right out of his mouth. This time, he was irritated, but not enough to even think about hurting her. Instead, he wanted to nuzzle his nose into her neck and hug her like his life depended on it. That urge made him all the more irritated. Damon clenched his jaw and stood up abruptly, flipping over his stool in the process. The fact that he didn't have control over everything he felt while he was around her was highly upsetting. And he couldn't even direct his anger at her like he wanted to. Those abysmal blue eyes of hers would shut him up in an instant. That's another upsetting thing added to the list. The bathroom's upstairs. You can bathe if you want. I don't care. And there's food in the fridge. If you want something to eat, make it yourself. And with that, he stalked off, nose flaring, eyes bulging with rage, and jaws clenched. Sarah confusedly watched his back as he walked away. He was obviously angry, but she couldn't tell why. It was her first time here, so the least he could do was to show her around and offer her food. But even that he couldn't do. He was certainly as cold-hearted as they said. After a long, cautious glance around the room she was in, Sarah slipped off the couch and allowed her bare feet to touch the fluffy mat on the floor. She didn't have any idea what she was supposed to do now, nor where she was supposed to go, but still, she took steps forward. It didn't seem like Damon cared where she went or what she did anyway. Made it to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 4. Unexpected Companions. Sarah's feet led her to nowhere other than the kitchen. Her stomach felt as if someone had dug a knife through her. Excruciating hunger wasn't a new feeling, but since she had the chance now, why not quench it? She first opened all the cupboards, then with a slow trudge, she walked towards the fridge and grasped the handle. Its sleek black color and expensive look made her pull softly so as to not damage it. The range of foods that greeted her eyes after doing so were like a dashing ray of sunshine in a place that only knew darkness. There were things that she rarely ever saw, much less ate, and other things that she was used to seeing rotten rather than fresh. With so many things to choose from, her indecision had aroused quickly. Each time her hand reached for something, it would change direction and go for another that seemed more appealing. Frankly, she wanted to taste a bit of everything, but she didn't bother to touch things like eggs and meat which were impossible to be eaten without cooking. She didn't know anything about cooking, so it would be terrible to try and do so now, especially since the kitchen and the house altogether belonged to Damon. In the end, she took out ice cream, 3 different flavored yogurts, cereals, and 2 plates of leftover food that she didn't even heat up. Damon had said that she could make herself some food. He didn't say how much nor what she was supposed to eat. She made use of that fact and had filled the table with everything that she wanted. Even if Damon got angry later on and slit her throat, at least she would die with a full stomach. Licking her lips, she glanced around in search of any prying eyes, then rubbed her hands together until her palms warmed before cheerily digging into her food. Everything she ate was icy and irritating to her teeth, but Sarah gobbled it all down with a happy smile on her lips. This was probably her only chance to eat as much as she wanted, and knowing how cruel Damon Calesta was, She feared that if she wasted away her time, he would show up any moment and ruin her feast. That would be quite unfortunate, considering how elated she was to have so many things at her fingertips. Before she got taken in by the people at the human trade branch, she was living on the streets. No family, no friends, no one. For food, she had to rummage through loads of garbage bins for crumbs that the fortunate had thrown away. Life at the dungeon was a little better than on the streets, in her opinion. She got to eat without having to do anything but sit around in her cell. Though at times, Mr. Knack refused to feed her, saying that the worthless shouldn't be fed. Now that she thought about it, she was fortunate to have been chosen by someone who owned such a large house and could give her so many things. There was a high chance that her life could take a huge turn, whether for the better or for the worse. Even if Damon abused or mistreated her in the future, it didn't really matter, because as long as she had food to eat and a roof over her head, everything was perfect. It didn't take long for her to finish everything laid out in front of her. Grinning, she patted her bloated stomach and stood up. Now that she had eaten, she felt a bit sleepy. She turned in the direction of the stairs and slid her right hand along the banister as she climbed it. Her only intention was to find her room, whichever one it was, take a bath, then go to sleep. But before she could even climb to the top of the stairs, 3 barricades came out of nowhere and stood in front of her. Sarah took a good look at the 3 women, from head down to toe. In seconds, she knew what they were. Sex slaves. The Alpha King's sex slaves. The numbers burnt into the side of their necks told her so. The realization unmistakably made her heart clench inside her chest. She resisted the urge to glare up at the woman as much as she resisted the urge to rub her aching chest. It was normal for kings to have a lot of women, so she shouldn't have felt wronged. In fact, she shouldn't have felt anything. But alas, she couldn't deny her feelings towards the situation. Sarah was sensible enough to gather that it was a result of the mate bond. Werewolves are naturally possessive over what's theirs, but it wasn't like she was a werewolf. She's a human. How could she feel so possessive over someone who doesn't even seem to have much interest in her? Dropping her hand from the banister, she fiddled with her fingers and bit her lip. "Hi," she said politely. It was initially supposed to come out in a cheerful tone, but Sarah failed to hide away her distaste. The women looked at each other, then burst out laughing. She raised a brow. "What? Did I say something funny?" Sarah was genuinely confused, but the girls took it as her attempt to be insolent. The first to sober up from laughter was Alexis. Her smile had literally died in an instant. "If you think you'll be treated better than us just because you're mates, then you better not kid yourself," she snared, flipping her hair as she sized Sarah up with her eyes. The 2 lackeys beside her nodded in agreement and lifted their chins, probably to seem intimidating. "I'm the one who gets all the attention around here. If you want to live here peacefully, drop that confident act. It'll be better for you that way." Sarah blinked, utterly taken aback by their accusations. She didn't exactly like the fact that they were here, but she wasn't against them or anything. She was even ready to make friends if they wanted. "I wasn't trying to act confident. I just said hi and you burst out laughing. Aren't you the ones who seem too confident?" The words that had came out of her mouth before she even processed what she was about to say. Her mouth had betrayed her, and it wasn't the first time either. She had gotten in trouble with Mr. Knack several times for the same reason, and yet she still hadn't learned her lesson. The astonished look on the girl's face pushed her to rectify her mistake. "I didn't mean you're confident or anything," she rushed through her words. "I just meant that you Shut it! Alexis was fuming now. Sarah had successfully gotten on her nerves. First, she came looking confident, and now she was acting all innocent. That was what irritated her. Clenching her jaws, she took a step forward, frightening Sarah to the bone. Seeing as the situation was getting out of hand, her friends attempted to remind her of Sarah's status as Damon's mate, but Alexis held her hand up, telling them to shut their mouths. Her eyes then narrowed in on her figure. She was now hell-bent on instilling fear into Sarah's very soul. "You," Alexis spat. She began poking her in the chest harshly, forcing her to take steps back while she took steps forward. "We're here last, so you should know your place, don't you think?" Sarah tensed nervously. As Alexis spat curse words at her, she continued to step backwards until she managed to clumsily trip over her own feet. She was bound to have fallen to her death, but her body never made contact with the hard floor. Instead, she collided with a rock-hard chest, and tingles immediately spread across her skin. It didn't take a genius to know who had just saved her from death's grip. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 5. His True Face. Damon's fingers gripped her shoulders tightly, holding her against his chest. As a result of their proximity, Sarah felt his heart beating against her back, but she failed to notice that the intervals between each heartbeat lessened as time passed. Before they could get too engrossed in each other's warmth, Damon tightened his hold on her shoulders and easily lifted her into the air, then swiveled on his feet and dropped her behind him. Sarah stiffened and stood silently in place like a statue, even when he placed her feet against the floor. She was too overwhelmed by both her near-death experience and Damon's abrupt appearance. "Alexis, I suppose you can tell me what's going on here," Damon boomed, facing the three girls that had been rendered dumb by the power of fear. Alexis, who was under the impression that Sarah fell because she poked her, flinched as her face drained of color. Guilt didn't run through her despite her thoughts. She was simply scared for her life, so much so that she wished she had not dared to encounter or even spoken to Sarah. She had a vague idea of what would happen next, but she couldn't bear to imagine herself in that position. She had been living here for 5 years straight, and now she was about to get in trouble because of a filthy woman who had just arrived hours ago over her dead body. "She was the one who started it first," Alexis cried, pointing at her with a petrified finger. Though Sarah's eyes widened at the false accusation, she didn't feel the least bit sorry. Lying was her only way out of this situation. "I was just going about my business when she threatened me." "Is that true?" Damon turned his head towards Sarah, eyes looking as cold as ice. She wasn't an idiot. She could easily tell that he was angry, very angry. But what made her quiver was the fact that his anger was directed at her, the innocent one. I didn't," she swallowed, fiddling with her fingers nervously. She desperately wanted to speak up for herself, but Damon's cold gaze stroked fear into her. It was her first time seeing him in this state. Last time, he had gotten angry at her for no reason, but this time was different. It didn't even seem like he recognized her as his mate, neither did it seem like he cared whether she was scared or not. "Are you incapable of speaking? Do I need to draw an answer out of you myself?" She flinched at the threat. Why was he angry at her when she didn't do anything? She looked up at the woman who had framed her, eyes catching the way her lips twitched upwards for a second, then downturned once more. She was enjoying this. That much was obvious. Her friends were silently standing by her, so they were just as bad as she was. Sarah frowned and directed her gaze back at Damon. To put it simply, he looked just about ready to murder someone. She couldn't just sit and let herself get accused. I didn't threaten anyone. From the corner of her eyes, she saw Alexis stiffen, but she didn't let that make her waver. She was the one who approached me and accused me of... Damon's command stopped her mid-sentence. Trixie! Hawkeye! He jerked his head towards Alexis's lackeys. Take her to her room. I'll deal with her later. What? Sarah looked at the back of his head with confusion swirling in her eyes. I didn't do... Before she could finish her sentence, the two girls rushed over to her, each grabbing an arm. She continued to plead as they began to drag her away, but Damon didn't even bat an eye, much less look at her. A few seconds later, she was harshly shoved into a bedroom, after which the door was rudely closed in her face. She didn't dare to open it herself as she was scared that the action would only aggravate Damon. With a sigh, she sat silently on the floor. Her mind was a complete mess at this point. Damon had disregarded her side of the story and had taken Alexis's side rather than hers. It was either he didn't trust her at all, or he had too much trust in Alexis. Sarah didn't know what torture he had in store for her, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to find out. Just thinking about what laid ahead made her face pale. Mr. Knack's tortures were unbearable, so only God could tell how cruelly she would be tortured by the Alpha King himself. I'll deal with her later. She remembered the last words Damon had uttered, and a shiver instantly racked through her. His voice had sounded so deadly and frightening. Sarah couldn't help but conclude that maybe life with him wouldn't be so perfect after all, even with all the luxuries considered. Clenching her eyes shut, she allowed herself to lay flat against the floor, dangerous anticipation coursing within her. The floor didn't feel anywhere near as cold as in her cell, but it still managed to remind her of her time there. She drew her legs closer to her chest, then sighed once more. Before long, a sleepy feeling overtook her, and she slowly caved in to sleep. A few moments later, the door was pulled open and someone stepped in. Sarah instinctively opened her eyes for a second and was met with Damon's cold gaze. Due to her sleepy state, her mind failed to process the danger she was supposed to be in now that he had arrived in their room. So without thinking too much about his presence, she closed her eyes once more and was seconds away from drifting away into Wonderland when one hand slipped beneath her back and the other slipped underneath her legs. Sarah unconsciously nuzzled into his warm embrace and shifted herself in his arms so she could get more comfortable. I've dealt with her for you, Damon whispered, but his words didn't quite register in her mind because by then she had already drifted away to sleep with tingles running wild on her skin. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 6. Running Away from Damon's Wrath. When Sarah awoke the next morning, she wasn't on the floor like she had expected. Instead, she was lying on a comfy, queen-sized bed with a fluffy pillow beneath her head and a blue duvet covering her feet up to her mid-waist. This was probably the reason why she had felt so comfortable in her sleep. Her body wasn't cramping everywhere, and she hadn't even stirred awake during the night like she always did whenever she slept in her cell. It had been years since she had even seen a bed, so saying it felt good to have slept on one would be an understatement. But how did she get on the bed? It couldn't have been Damon who relocated her, could it? She shook her head at the thought. It wasn't him. He wasn't that gracious at all. She tossed that possibility aside and jumped to the conclusion that maybe one of the girls had placed her there to soothe their guilt. After what Damon did last night, there wasn't the slightest possibility that he would be so nice. He had robbed her of her right to speak against Alexis's false claims, and even though it was a brand new day, she still felt disturbed by it. He even threatened to deal with her later, for heaven's sake. Speaking of which, she had no idea why she hadn't gotten her share of torture last night, but she wouldn't let that fool her. Damon would soon come bursting through the door with shackles in one hand and a baton in the other. He'd chain her to the bed, and then he'd beat the life out of her until she wouldn't be able to even speak. That was usually what Mr. Knack did most of the times, aside from forcing himself onto her. Damon's beatings would definitely be more dangerous and severe, but Sarah didn't even want to think about it nor imagine it. All she was going to do was wait dreadfully until he came and delivered her punishment like a good little sex slave. That way, she'd at least get out of it with her life intact. But that moment never came. After bathing, brushing her teeth, and dressing herself in the clothes she found in the closet, she waited and waited and waited. But Damon didn't show up. Relief was what any normal person would have felt. But Sarah's dread had only increased. In her mind, Damon was waiting and hoping for the moment where she was at her finest, and then he would strike. Surely, it was quite wrong of her to think so negatively of him and make unverified judgments. But her mind had already been corrupted by rumors, so it only came to her naturally. It wasn't like she wanted to think the way she did. She just couldn't help herself. When waiting it out became too difficult because of her growing hunger, Sarah climbed out of bed and tiptoed down the stairs. There was no telling what Damon would do once he saw her, so her steps were cautious, as they should be. As she descended, her eyes were glued to the spot in front of her so as to sight any oncoming danger. But her clumsiness came into action for a second time, and she managed to misstep. Luckily, she caught her balance at the last minute by tightly grabbing onto the banister. Sarah dropped her head and patted her chest as she recovered from her frightened state. That was how her eyes managed to spot it. There was red liquid on the staircase that looked awfully similar to blood. A lot of it. Sarah's eyes widened and she quickly shifted herself over to the other side of the stair, where the liquid was less dense. "Is that blood? Or something else?" she stammered out, staring down at it. There wasn't really any solid specifics that pointed towards the latter, and on the other hand, if it happened to be blood, whom did it belong to? Sarah didn't bother to pressure her mind further. She made one dash down the stairs and finally took a good breath of fresh air once she was on the level floor. Whatever it was, she didn't want to know. She's already this close to vomiting as it was. Brushing her frazzled hair behind her ears, she walked through the house and towards the kitchen. It was past dinner time already, so she predetermined that no one was in the dining room. But she proved herself to be wrong when she turned the corner and saw 3 figures residing there. Trixie and Haggai were sitting opposite to each other, while Damon was sitting at the far end of the table, secluded to himself. When she entered the room, no one lifted their heads. Even the girls who had been talking to each other before she came in silenced themselves upon her appearance. What was this? The invisible treatment or the silent treatment? Whatever it was, Sarah didn't care. Whatever Damon had in store for her, she didn't want it. Delay, delay, delay. That was what she'd do, until he eventually forgets that he owed her a beating. Yes, that's what she'd do. It wasn't a sure plan, but it was worth a try. Plus, it happened a lot with Mr. Knack, though the culprit for that is most likely his old age. She had been standing there for about 2 minutes, trapped in her thoughts, yet still, nobody even glanced at her. This was it, her chance to swoop back into the shadows without being spotted. After removing herself from her stiffened state, she drew one foot backwards, then another. Her worry lessened as she slowly eased out of harm's way. But just as she was about to take the last step backwards that would take her out of their sight completely, a man's voice stopped her, rooting her feet to the ground with its undeniable authority. "Don't you dare take another step further." And then, bam! Reality dawned on her. She was going to feel Damon's wrath. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 7. Alone with Damon Calesto. "Don't you dare take another step further." Damon's voice boomed off the walls and temporarily pinned Sarah's feet to the ground. Her heart nearly leaped through her chest. Damon was now up and ready to unleash his impending wrath. If she didn't run away now, then she was surely going to get it. Her left foot just needed to slide a little bit further backwards, and then she would have defied his orders. But despite the prominent urge to do, Sarah chose to do the opposite that would probably give her less pain. She gulped thickly and willed her heart to slow down the pace of its beating before she took shaky steps forward and landed herself at the other far end of the table. Licking her lips, she drew out the chair and slowly took a seat, but the moment her butt touched the wooden chair, Haggai and Trixie took a downcast glance at her. Sarah had no idea why, but their eyes were filled with hatred, pure hatred. Last night, when they had their disagreements, it didn't look like they hated her all that much. They simply seemed to have been following Alexis's lead, but now, they obviously carried immense hatred for a reason that was unknown to her. That didn't stop Sarah from starting a conversation, though. "Hi," she smiled at the girls awkwardly. "Where's your other friend?" Truthfully, Sarah didn't care about Alexis's whereabouts. Those words were simply the first to come to mind. Plus, the silence was heavily disturbing. Talking about random things was her way of breaking it. But to her embarrassment, none of the girls answered her question nor even had the decency to greet her. Sarah turned her eyes to Damon in silent expectancy. He hadn't even raised his head, not even when he commanded her not to leave the room. He was sitting forward in his seat, picking at his food as he stared down at the 2 plates of spaghetti in front of him. Sarah frowned but didn't say anything. Nobody wanted to talk? Fine. She was more than capable of ignoring them, too. She rose from her chair and slowly trudged over to the fridge. Sadly, though, there wasn't any leftover food inside, so Sarah had to make do with a plate of cereal. After readying her cereal, she moved back towards her seat and sat down, settling the plate atop the table. It was that point in time when Haggai and Trixie got up from their seats, glared at her, then left the dining room without another word. And it was also that same point in time when Damon finally rose his head to look at her. Sarah shifted in her seat awkwardly, eyes casted towards her cereal. A few seconds of silence passed before she heard the sound of his chair scraping against the floor. Her eyes rose upwards to see Damon rising from his seat with one of 2 plates of food in his hand. Sarah couldn't even sit still with all the anticipation she had developed from just his presence, so when he abruptly stood up and approached her, one could only imagine how she must have felt. Each step she took sent another wave of dread through her being. Sarah didn't know what to do in her current situation. He didn't seem to be as angry as he was last night, but he did seem a little grumpy. Now that the girls were gone, perhaps he was now ready to do his worst. Who's to tell? But unbeknownst to her, Damon had no intention of hurting her. "I'll deal with her later." Those words of his didn't mean the same thing that Sarah thought it meant. He wasn't planning on hitting her. He simply wanted to hold a very serious conversation. There were some things he wanted to ask. A lot of things. At the time, his wording was undeniably misleading. However, it was because he was accustomed to wording things in that particular way. But Sarah had absolutely no knowledge of that. When he drew out a chair, she tensed. When he placed the chair beside her, her face drained of color. And when he took a seat, her heartbeat sped up faster than ever. She was terrified. It was obvious, and though she didn't know it, her reaction to him was making him agitated. "I'm not going to hurt you," he assured with a bored, unconvincing look on his face. When she didn't answer and simply kept her head down, he pushed her cereal away and placed the spaghetti in front of her before he reclined in his chair and folded his arms across his chest. "I already said I wasn't going to hurt you, so slow down your heartbeat a little. It's disturbing." Sarah jolted in her seat, head snapping in his direction. At first, she was astonished by his words, but afterwards, she suddenly remembered that he was a werewolf, an alpha at that. Remembering that fact only made her all the more anxious in his presence. After all, he could hear things from afar that normal humans wouldn't be able to hear, and he could even crush a full-grown man's head with his bare hands. If that wasn't frightening enough, then she didn't know what was. "Yes, sir." Sarah was up and ready to do whatever it took to please him. However, she was unsure of how she was going to go about it. Slow down her heartbeat? The only thing that came to mind was to breathe in and out until she calmed down and her breathing stabilized. Since it was the only option she had, she attempted the act. However, saying it was working would be a big lie. She had rather gotten worse. Damon rolled his eyes as he watched her with an expression that suggested that he thought she was very idiotic. "Your heart's beating 2 times faster than before," he said simply, earning him a dreadful look from Sarah. He sighed. "I don't usually go around telling others my weaknesses, but if it puts you at ease, then I'll let you know that werewolves cannot hurt their mates. Even if I wanted to, the mate bond we share would prevent me from doing so." Sarah blinked and cocked her head to the side in confusion as she tried to figure out if he was lying or not. When he said those words, her ears managed to pick up the irritation in his tone. Why would he have been irritated if it was a lie? And what good would lying to her do? Damon was the Alpha King, so if he wanted to, he could kill her right this instant. Why would he lie just to get her to be at ease? Plus, that good-looking face of his didn't suggest that he was lying at all. But then again, she couldn't be so sure. He did say that he was going to deal with her. How did he plan to deal with her without hurting her? Swallowing most of her fear, she sat up in her seat and turned fully in his direction. Her first attempt at speaking left her mouth wide open with her words stuck in her throat. Her second attempt at speaking left her stammering, to the point where Damon didn't understand a word she was saying. When she did manage to get her words in check, Damon's attention had already been diverted to her full lips that wobbled every once in a while. Her fight for words had coincidentally led his eyes in that direction. Big mistake. Rather than listening to her, he was now fully focused on her lips. He even took notice of the small lines that became more prominent whenever they puckered, and not to mention the pink flush that adorned her lips and made them all the more alluring and inviting. As he continued to stare, a small voice in his head kept repeating the same words over and over. It was the voice of his wolf counterpart, who rarely ever made himself known. Damon was perplexed. However, it wasn't the sound of his wolf's voice that perplexed him. It was the words. "Kiss her," was what his wolf said.